The federal government has made a commitment to meet NATO's spending target this fiscal year, boosting Canada's defence spending by billions.
We saw yesterday, I think, probably one of the most important investments in national defence in the last 75 years. Very significant investments where we hope they count, which is going to be at the very, very essential levels.
A recent NATO report estimates that Canada spent 1.45% on its GDP on defence in 2024. Mark Carney's government is now vowing to increase that to the 2% target by next March. And to get there, Carney says Canada will make $9.3 billion in additional defence spending. But how is the government going to pay for all of this defence spending while building big and cutting taxes? Well, Kevin Page is the president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. He's also the former parliamentary budget officer, and he joins me now. Kevin Page, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here, sir.
Good to be with you, David.
Big picture, what does adding all of this defence money mean for the overall fiscal outlook? Where do you think we are right now?
Well, I think we're probably, we're talking about a deficit that's going to be much bigger than what we were talking about last December when the government released the fall update. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around this, where the fiscal position of the government is at, because the numbers that underpin the Liberal platform they're outdated now. The economy has changed, and it's just unclear. Like, this announcement was not part of the Liberal platform. It's a much earlier commitment to get to the 2% target. So there's a more deficit pressure now than there was in the Liberal, highlighted in the Liberal platform.
So there's this. There is the commitment through the First Minister's meeting and the process there to build big on accelerating national projects, and some of that could require federal money on unlocking some of those infrastructure projects. We don't know yet. And there is the tax cut. I mean, since we last spoke, well, things have changed. There was going to be a budget in the fall. But, you've got Parliament voting on all of these things, being asked to move on these things on the supplementary estimates, and we kind of don't know where the overall fiscal health is. I mean, how challenging is that for you, for banks, for bond raters, and for members of Parliament and Canadians?
Well, I think everybody wants to see a number, and in the vacuum of a number in terms of the fiscal position of the government, what is the size of the deficit, the size of the debt for 2025-26, what do those interest payments look like? So I think the pressure is just mounting for the government to release that type of information, if only for 25-26, and if only for the announcements that they've made recently, and then come back in the fall with a more fulsome document. But I mean, clearly the bond rating agencies, they want to see this document, and I think, for us to hold on to our AAA credit status, I think it's important to put out have that kind of transparency. These are big, as the Minister of National Defence highlighted, a $9 billion cash increase to defence spending. That's enormous.
Do you think, though, that the AAA credit rating could be vulnerable here with the pace and scale of what we're seeing? Because I know that was a real third rail for Chrystia Freeland when she was the finance minister, that, whatever guided, whatever spending and expansion of the government they did, she never wanted to put that at risk. Do you think we're in that situation because of the economic uncertainty caused by Trump and this spending plan?
Well, I think there's these risks exist from bond rating agencies. I think I think people also understand that we have this change. We have a new prime minister. We have this G7 meeting. There's been meetings with NATO. Our NATO colleagues. The pressure to get to 2% is there. But yeah, just to roll this up into some sort of financial document, some sort of financial plan. And it has to go beyond the press release that we got from the Prime Minister yesterday, just effectively a page saying this is how the $9 billion break down, because there's so many questions that go beyond, like, does $9 billion even get you to 2%? Like, again, we're a $3.2 trillion economy. So you might, people like me start to say, well, does that even, you might need to spend more than that. What is the baseline for the Defense Department and other, defense-related NATO spending? Are we going to hold on to 2%, between now and 2030, when the government kind of committed to get to that? Because that means a much bigger deficit track kind of going forward if we hold on to the 2%. Yeah, I think just a lot of unanswered questions, and we understand G7 meeting, but I think coming after the G7 meeting, we're going to need a financial document.
Right. Okay. Look, I just want to focus again on the credit rating. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but you brought it up and people are going to react to it. So are we talking about this as a possible risk or as a probable risk, or is it actually a risk right now? I mean, where do you think it is? Would people like to see something, or are we really in danger if we don't get something soon as a country?
No, I think it's, I mean, the risk is there. So maybe it, to use your terminology, I think it's like there's a possible risk.
Okay.
I think, like, again, I think we're talking about a deficit now that's, and it will be in the 2% range. I think in the fall update, we were talking, 2% is in terms of a percentage of GDP, probably something, closer to $60 billion. That's, again, we still don't know what other measures that were in the platform that will actually have an impact on the deficit in 2025-26. We don't know, like, to what extent this $9 billion cash increase, how is it going to be financed? Is it financed through lap spending in other departments? Is it, is this going to be part of a spending review exercise that will help create some fiscal space for this reallocation towards, defense spending? So yeah, these are questions, I think. But Parliament needs this information as well. They need to know before they vote on the tax cut, on this potential these spending for military. What is it? What is the fiscal position of the government, at least for 25-26, and then a full 5-year update, a 5-year budget plan come the fall.
There's 4 ways to kind of deal with this stuff. You tax, you borrow, you cut, or you grow. They've cut taxes, and Mark Carney has ruled that out. Growth seems like a challenging thing to do at this scale with everything coming from the White House these days. So there's obviously going to be some borrowing on the books, but then there's the cut side of the equation that we don't know where that's going to go. But we know there is an expenditure reduction process, to use the terminology, underway. Your successor, Mr. Giroux, the current parliamentary budget officer, said in the Ottawa Citizen recently that the plan to sort of cap the rate of growth of the core government from 9% down to 2%, that in itself won't be enough. I mean, what's your sense of what could be, on the menu in terms of options of reductions in terms of size and scale if it goes that far?
Yeah, so I think, again, there's a fiscal target one of the fiscal targets that was in the Liberal platform was to get to something called an operating balance in 2028-29. And to run deficits that only for this additional capital spending, which is a key part of the Liberal platform. So, I mean, I think, and the Liberals promised to get something like $30 billion worth of savings from spending, in that Liberal platform, over the next, 4 years, including this year. So, I guess there's talk already within the public service in terms of how to find some of these savings. So some of that $9 billion, even in 2025-26, this $9 billion of defense spending, that's going to probably come through some reallocation. So there's going to be, it's more than a cap on the public service. They're going to have to look to, to transfers, not transfers necessarily to persons, the big ones like old age security, or transfers to provinces like Canada Health transfers. But, a lot of the other transfers that, that are part of that, program spending base, direct program spending base that we see in, highlighted in budgets. So yeah, I think they're going to have to broaden the base. They're going to need more of a spending review to actually kind of hit that target 2020-29 of an operating balance.
Right, and just as a final point, the $9 billion for defense that they announced yesterday, some of that salaries, training, and retention, that will go presumably in the operating side of things. Some of the defense industry scale up and equipment purchases, that goes on the capital side of things, right? So in their way or intention on budgeting, these things split in different directions when we're talking about what they're looking to cut to balance things out.
Yeah, I think one thing we're looking for, David, when we get either the update or the budget in the fall is, like, what are those accounting rules that will separate operating and capital? Because even on that $9 billion that you alluded to, like, most of that is cash related. It's not accrual. There's not a lot of capital necessarily in that. Some capital repairs certainly, but a lot of that could be determined as as the operating side of the budget, which will put a lot of pressure on the operating budget, and perhaps more of a spending cut to get to offset that.
Okay, Kevin Page, a lot of numbers, a lot of math, and a lot of answers. We're still waiting for that one. Maybe we'll see when we get a budget in the fall. That's Kevin Page, president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Always good to talk to you, sir. Thanks for being here.
Be with you, David.
Today's F-35 report criticized the Liberals for misleading cost projections that are 50% higher by over $14 billion, ongoing construction delays for necessary infrastructure, ignoring the severe pilot and mechanic shortage, and implementing weak oversight mechanisms. The ministers who are responsible for this debacle are still sitting in here. Will the Prime Minister hold them accountable for this mess?
I'd like to know if the member opposite holds himself accountable for letting military spending fall below 1% of GDP. That's right. When the Conservatives were in government. This government has doubled military spending in cash terms. We're meeting our NATO obligations this year.
He actually delivered for our military. The question is, the foreign minister who was responsible for the military back in 2018 is still in his cabinet. Why?
I was proud to stand yesterday with the Minister of National Defence, the Chief of the Defence Force, and announce the largest increase in military expenditure in decades.
So in addition to the F-35 costs and $9 billion for defense, the government has also announced plans to build big national projects and deliver a middle-class tax cut. So how does the government pay for all of that? We're going to start there with the Power Panel. Emily Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir. Françoise Boivin is a former NDP MP. And here with me in the studio, Michelle Cadario is a former Liberal National Campaign Director, and Kate Harrison is a Conservative political analyst. It's good to see you all. Michelle, there's a lot of billions. And a lot of B's for billions, no B for budget. But, you know, we're kind of getting it in reverse. All the details in the spending announcements up front, so the bigger picture down the road. But they're going to have to make some tough choices on the spending side to make all of this work, is what it seems to me. How do you view where the government is going with things?
Well, you know, I think that the Prime Minister is staying true to his word. He talked about build, baby, build, and it seems that we're building a lot. And, you know, it's also interesting in the defense announcement, it wasn't just about paying money and paying other countries and paying, you know, foreign companies to build our stuff. He really wants to reinvigorate some kind of a Canadian defense industry here and spend money here, which means jobs here. And kind of that kind of reinvestment that he started talking about, and you know how he talked about having leveraging private sector dollars for public sector dollars. So I think that is in his mind for sure. Obviously, we're not going to have the capacity to do absolutely everything, and I think that we're all still just kind of getting over the shock of that big number. But it is a commitment that we've made decades ago, and it's one that every government since then, including the one that I was a part of, failed to meet. So, you know, he's laying it out, and you know, he's laying it out for Canadians ahead of bringing forward a budget. So there's no surprises in the budget. They know what his priorities are, and it's what he ran on.
Kate, we know what his priorities are, and we're seeing him move on that quickly. But he also talked about, in his speech announcing they would hit the 2% NATO target, sacrifice. And we don't know what that's going to be. We know there's a program review going on of some sort to reduce spending inside the core government in some fashion and in some form. I don't know if that's the sacrifice or if it's just this gobbles up fiscal space so you can't do other things. But it seems like some tough choices, if you're going to keep doing all of these things, are going to have to be made.
Yeah, a review of government spending has been a perennial activity on the part of governments. I have never seen the amount of that total $9 billion through efficiencies. It's constantly the government that's reminding us that they can't do that without either significant job cuts or, as the PBO alluded to earlier, moving money from one department to another. So that may be the surprise out of this when we do have a budget, if and when that should ever appear, is how money might be moved in order to make this happen. Michelle is right to note that this is an overdue commitment. Even when we get to that 2%, we still may be at the end of the G7 totem pole because other allies are moving to 3 or 4 or 5%. But at the same time, we don't have a lot of clarity today in terms of how that number will be met. So it's a good communications effort, but it's not necessarily an action plan.
Yeah, look, it's an overdue commitment, not just to hit the NATO target, but if you're going to ask people to sign up for your military to serve the country, give them the parts they need to fix the broken equipment so, you know, they can do their job. I mean, otherwise, what are we doing, right? So, Françoise, what do you make of this? Because it is big money going into things, mostly with the idea of creating some economic growth, even on the defense side, the scaling up of the defense industry, looking at defense spending as industrial policy. But they say they won't touch the big programs, they won't touch transfers to individuals, they won't touch transfers to provinces. How do you balance it all out?
Well, you have to permit me to be a bit worried, especially in view of the report from the Vérificatrice Générale, because on expense, on military expense, she laid down the proof that there were a lot of things that didn't work well. There were some good justification, like Minister McGuinty was explaining about the actual situation. But if you read the report, you see that there were a lot of things that went wrong. And what scares me a tiny bit is, yes, Michel, you're right. He kind of promised that he would spend the 2% for military, but not in 1 year, and actually less than 1 year already, because the year will end in next March. So that's pretty quick to spend that type of money. And knowing their past experience on how they do things, I have to now make a leap of faith and believe that maybe their new bill on how they spend and how they allocate money will be better done than past indication shows us. So you're right, David, in saying that it's a lot of money. And if in 2 years' time we get a super bad report from the AG, but nobody questions, nobody asks to see numbers prior and see how we can pay for all that, I'm not putting in question the fact that we need to do so, because it's long overdue. We all agree on that. But we have to do it right, and we have to do it in a realistic way, knowing that it's not the government's money. I don't know how many times I have to repeat this. It is our money.
Sure.
It's the, so that's why it becomes a bit more scary. I don't mind giving you money, David, and say, hey, go spend it. But I would like to know ahead of time where you're going to spend it and how much you are going to put into it and what's going to be my return.
Well, you can send it an e-transfer to me directly after the show,
Okay,
and I'll
we'll
send you
do
my
it
receipts
right
of where
now.
I spent it.
Procurement will be so much faster.
It would be. But Emily, part of me wonders if this push to get to 2% so quickly, I mean, the supplementary estimates were coming out, but it has to do with the meeting coming up in Kananaskis and with the G7 and trying to, move on that and settle that as you try to normalize things with the United States. Maybe that is it, and maybe it's a good strategy and a good tactic, but it's a lot of money that you need to sort of balance out right now while we're kind of operating without even sort of a baseline fiscal projection for the government.
So everyone's right to point out that this is a long-time commitment, that is something that comes from ages ago. And that is both the good and the bad thing about this and what concerns me, in the sense that NATO countries are now rushing to rise their defense spending, which is really good for basically sovereignty protection, if that is the goal, what you want to do with your army. And I think as Canadians, we've learned to know that just defending our own land is really something that's really important and dear to all of us that we maybe took for granted. But there's also a fast technological shift in warfare. And I'm wondering, and I would love for questions to be posed to the Prime Minister in terms of, are we catching up now to buying things that would have been useful in 20th century warfare, in the sense that we've just seen with Ukraine's attack on Russian planes, how the cost of attacking has basically dwindled. It's now nothing, and the cost of national defense has exploded. It's the same thing with the attack of the Hamas on Israel, or even the attack of 9/11. So those are very efficient attack in terms of casualties and people dying, but that have cost absolutely nothing at all. The same thing with any sort of attack that comes from basically the internet and ruining a country's capacity to communicate with one another. Those are attacks that cost basically $0. And so we need to make sure that we understand what warfare and what wars look like in this century. And part of me feels like we are now buying things that would have been useful in 95. And I want to make sure that people in Canada understand the shift in warfares that are happening now, because otherwise we look at those stats and we look at those long-term commitment and we look like a bunch of redcoats trying to basically make sure
Right.
that we're going to be ready for something like a cannon that's coming from the future.
Well,
so it's really, really important for us to catch up with that.
Yeah, well, I take your point, and there has been a shift and an evolution in it, but like the lack of tanks and infantry and cannons and stuff in Ukraine was a real problem, because it is an old school kind of war happening there. So, but you know, the F-35 thing, Michelle, I think air superiority in all contexts, and Arctic patrol. I mean, they need to go down this path to have that capacity as their commitments to the military alliance. But do you see a link potentially with the acceleration of this move and the meeting coming up, and just trying to clear the decks on some outstanding bones of contention with the U.S. president and the other G7 partners?
100%.
Yeah.
You know, without question, the timing is not a shock. You know, the Minister of Defense was at a NATO meeting this week as well, and I think that there's a NATO meeting for all the leaders towards the end of June. So, so yeah, you know, why hold on to that news when it is something that, you know, and it's not just, you know, the United States that's looking for that; it's all of Europe that's looking for it, right? It's I think that if they're all stepping forward, they want to step forward together, and I don't think that Canada wants to be a laggard on that. The whole global situation has just changed so fundamentally, and I think that, you know, the Prime Minister has been very clear that he actually wants Canada positioned much more at the front end of this, and to be much more of a leader in terms of the alliances that he's building. And, you know, and he's very much talking about, you know, the defense of tomorrow, when you're talking about satellites and you know, ocean bed radar systems and all of that, things that weren't quite contemplated, you know, when we did our defense review back in the early 2000s. And I think that that is a really interesting maybe way for Canada to maybe start to develop some real expertise, and to actually become kind of a thought leader or a technical leader in different things. And I just don't think that the Prime Minister, I don't know him super well, but he sure doesn't seem to me to be the kind of guy who just writes something on the back of a napkin and says, here's our new defense policy. He is a thoughtful individual who has undoubtedly done his homework.
I know, I'm certainly not trying to suggest any of this is whimsy. You know, like there's a deliberate, that's why I ask if it is connected to other things, because, Kate, there does seem to be technical and strategic implications behind every move this Prime Minister is making in the early days. But this brings defense spending now up to about $62 billion. Yeah. A year, or at least in the NATO calculation. To get to the 3.5, which is the next target they're talking about, we're talking $110 billion a year on a budget that's about $400 billion. I mean, we're talking real cash that's going to squeeze out the ability to do a lot of other things.
Yeah, and the reason it hasn't happened so far is largely political, and that's not necessarily this government's problem or the government before it or the government before it. But
it's a Canadian problem.
Generally have less of an appetite to spend on defense, vice healthcare and education, and a number of other more social programming and priorities. So that is why there may be a test here for the government in terms of showing the math. You know, I suspect if Conservatives had an announcement like Mr. Carney did today, with a macro number of $9 billion and no information in terms of how that was going to be paid for, or answering the question what would be cut, we would be having a very different conversation on this show in terms of demanding that accountability. So I think that it's fair for Canadians to ask where that money is going to come from. It's also fair to criticize this government for making this announcement around the time of this visit. It could have happened before. Right. I don't think that's a happy coincidence. I think that's a direct line, not a dotted one, in terms of Donald Trump being in our backyard. We didn't need to wait for that to make an announcement of this significant spending.
Well, I do want to say we have been having the conversation about where are we going to get the money for, and we had it with Kevin Page and we had it with Karen Hogan. So I mean, like I take your point, but it is they've shown the expenditure side of the ledger. They have not shown the other side, and we do kind of need to see that.
Yeah, exactly. The PBO makes a good point that knowing the financial health of the country before committing to another $9 billion in spending would be a prudent and wise fiscal thing to do.
Just for information purposes, if nothing else.